Pope Francis, Dictator or Defender, by the Conventual Sisters of St. Dominic. Pope Francis may go down as one of the most maligned popes in Catholic history. This is due to the power of the modern media and the unbelievable scarcity of truth in the same. It's excruciatingly difficult to find any fair and true assessment of Pope Francis's general theological and spiritual emphasis and style, because we who imbibe what's out there in the media don't require much in the way of credibility. We're just happy to have our little superficial prejudices about the man verified. Most of the media coverage about this Pope, as is true for most topics in the media, simply feeds off itself, rather than on any first-hand acquaintance with what he has actually taught and why. It simply responds to and reflects the appetite of the modern mind for quick-fix information or political gossip, let's not call it wisdom, that a person can absorb on the run, avoiding any serious examination of actual data. The result is a profile of Pope Francis as a left-wing bureaucrat with a politically driven social justice type agenda and lots of support for and appeal to the more secular and woke elements of modern society, rather than to those who hold to traditional Catholic spirituality, morality, and doctrine. This all too common assessment of Francis's personality and pontificate has taken solid root over the 12 years of his pontificate. There is much talk now of the need of the new Pope Leo XIV to unite a seriously divided Church, and it seems that many blame Pope Francis either directly or indirectly for this state of disunity. The great omission from practically all media coverage of what Pope Francis has said and done is any reference to the primary sources, his teachings, issued through the official channels used by popes as the true articulators of the tenets of the Catholic faith. These channels take the form of documentation, which is obviously the most reliable of sources through which a man's mind and convictions come to be known with any certainty. It's just a crying shame, then, that we've allowed the full scope of Pope Francis's pontificate to elapse with scarcely a reference to what he actually taught, while his reputation as either an iconoclast or a validator of secularism is built up with every shoddy and malicious media take on his doings and sayings. Leaving aside the superficiality of the media's preference for dubious secondary sources and the quickest of quick-fix analyses, it's not to the Catholic Church's credit that even some of the most eminent churchmen, who should have understood Pope Francis's teachings and agreed with them, have led and or confirmed the faithful in various incorrect interpretations of those teachings. It seems that these august leaders in the Church with high degrees and powerful roles have been politically won over by disaffected lay groups, and in their turn led them further into schismatic and heretical paths. It would probably be quite a shock to most commentators on Pope Francis to realize that he has written and or signed off on a great many teaching and regulatory documents over his years in office. Yet so far as the media and their adherents are concerned, these documents might be confined to Amoris Laetitia, about love in the family, Fiducia Supplicans, offering pastoral blessings to those in irregular unions, and Traditiones Custodes, laying down conditions for the celebration of the older, extraordinary form of the Mass. These three hit definite nerve endings and became the cause of much controversy, especially amongst traditionally minded Catholics. Each was subjected to gross and sometimes culpable misreading, and to the political hype that is both the inevitable cause and effect of this. It's essential that a true interpretation of some of Francis's documents be put out there for the information of people who like truth and who want to be loyal to it as dispensed in the teachings of the Catholic Church. Every Catholic should know, although many have denied this knowledge or been persuaded otherwise by their media gurus, that popes do not teach moral or doctrinal error. The tendency today to soak up media criticism of a pope's teaching and level accusations against him of heresy, even raising doubts as to the validity of his papacy, is a denial of Christ's mandate and of his promises to the successors of St. Peter. It's serious enough to put a person outside the Church. What are some of the key and often controversial teaching documents written or signed off by Pope Francis? How important are they? How relevant? How true? One of the most recent and probably most fundamental documents coming out from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith is Dignitas Infinita. It has been given practically no media coverage. It was prepared at the instruction of Pope Francis for the purpose of making known the what, why, and wherefore of human dignity and its violations in our time. Would anyone deny that this is a burning issue in our world? The document provides a searing commentary on some of the violations of human dignity in the world, which we would like to forget because their solutions are so hard to find and apply. However, this should only make our reading and absorption of this document more necessary. Dignitas Infinita brings home to us, quote, that all human beings created by God and redeemed by Christ must be recognized and treated with respect and love due to their inalienable dignity. End quote, from paragraph 2. It makes those vital distinctions unknown to most of us between ontological dignity, which all human beings have purely because they are, quote, willed, created, and loved by God, end quote, from paragraph 7. Moral dignity, by which we raise or lower our dignity according to our moral choices and behaviour. Social dignity, our quality of life within society. And our existential dignity, by which we all struggle to live with peace, love, and joy, even with our personal deficiencies and needs, from paragraph 8. To most Catholics, the mention of the title Amoris Laetitia is like a red rag to a bull. This beautiful and very practical exhortation on a richer and more sanctifying living of life in the family has been reduced in the public mind to what is actually an impoverished, negative, and basically ignorant reading of a single footnote inserted into one of the document's pages. This is all most Catholics seem to know about the document. It's become a kind of symbol of the heterodoxy attributed to Pope Francis. What riches does Amoris Laetitia actually contain? To begin with, it is biblically and theologically rooted, explaining the family, the marital union, the struggle for work, the presence of children, and the inevitability of suffering. The lived experience of families today is described frankly with the acknowledgement of the fact that no family is perfect, and that there's perennial need for change in hearts. There's a reassuring summary of past magisterial teachings. The Pope concludes with a chapter on the spirituality of marriage and the family, and demonstrates the developments on the topic introduced by Vatican II and Pope St. John Paul II, and continued up to today. Practically speaking, the Pope issues strong, realistic teaching about the upbringing of children who need correction, good habit formation, and clear moral guidance. The challenges for fathers are faced, especially in discipline and home life. Chapter 7, dealing with this, is a must-read for all modern parents. The Pope acknowledges the fact that large families are a joy for the Church, yet he doesn't forget to exhort childless couples to make God's love present in other creative ways open to them. He describes a spirituality of family made up of positive, loving communion, Christ-centered focus during trials, shared celebrations, family prayer, shared Eucharist, the daily choice of faithful spousal love, hospitality, and a caring, supportive family environment. It throws out a sensitive, caring, fatherly challenge to families in a time when society denigrates their efforts and destabilizes them on 1,000 fronts. It's just a burning shame that all most Catholics seem to know about this document is that it's heretical and to be avoided for the sake of their spiritual health. As for the footnote, it does no more than present the standard moral teaching on the subject of giving Holy Communion to couples in irregular marital unions, if interpreted according to the Pope's mind, which every Catholic is bound to do, and in accordance with Catholic teaching. Laudato Si is another document coming from Pope Francis that served to brand him as a rabid environmentalist and advocate of climate change. No one expects a pope to be an expert on scientific matters, but he does teach validly on theological and moral principles. In this encyclical, Pope Francis confronts such errors as letting ecological problems solve themselves by the use of new technologies, which may in turn create new problems, or the idea that human beings are per se a threat to the planet, thus reversing the purposes of creation. The Pope highlights the divine plan in creation and the effects of human sin on the delicate equilibrium of the natural world. He shows up the moral dystopia of human trafficking and the destruction of unwanted human beings. He warns that, quote, concern for the protection of nature is incompatible with the justification of abortion, end quote, from paragraph 120, a particularly salient lesson for so many environmentalists. Other takeaways from this document include an exhortation to change our way of looking at progress, applying moral and social principles to technology, science, and economics. The Pope stresses overall the need for care of our human environment in the light of human dignity, the moral law, service to the common good, and the principles of justice. Something of an extension to the topic of this encyclical, but fast becoming a major concern in itself, is the question of AI, which came quite recently in a document from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. It's entitled Antiqua et Nova, and it explains clearly the limits of the morality of AI in the light of a true understanding of human intelligence in God's plan. There's no attempt in this document to present the final word on AI, but to offer guidance to those of goodwill, covering issues of concern related to society, human relationships, the economy, and labour, healthcare, education, information, privacy and surveillance, protection of the planet, warfare, and above all, our relationship with God. This document is another indication of Pope Francis as a wise analyst and father, seeking to enlighten and protect us from the complex problems thrown up by a social and moral scene that we can scarcely grasp, let alone hope to negotiate unaided. Another document which has served to condemn Pope Francis to the status of heretic is that unread and grossly miscomprehended document from the DDF entitled Fiducia Supplicans. Many of the commentaries simply dismiss it as an invitation by the Church to bless homosexual or irregular heterosexual marriages. Without going into all the subjective nuances people read into this document, it should be known that it does quite explicitly emphasize the traditional Catholic teaching on marriage, along with an explicit statement that there is, therefore, no such thing as homosexual marriage. However, it's accused of allowing priests to bless couples in irregular unions, when all it does, and its clarifications make this quite clear, is offer individual blessings to homosexuals and individuals in irregular marital relationships. There's not much new here. Blessings have always been dispensed to those who ask for them, regardless of their purity of soul or moral lifestyle. But in a world where LGBTQ matters have become controversial in one sense and commonplace in another, moral issues come into play that Christians and particularly priests have to deal with in wisdom and charity. To accuse Pope Francis of inviting the Church to recognize the unrecognizable and to bless the unblessable is a sign that someone is not using their God-given reading comprehension skills. It's quite amazing to note the number of high-level prelates and church intelligentsia who still don't seem to have read what the document is saying. Much of the disparagement and resentment levelled at Pope Francis over most of his pontificate has arisen from his being some kind of liturgical slob, impatient with those who love traditional forms of worship and favourable to the lovers of debased liturgy. His motu proprio Traditionis Custodes, in which he called for both dignity and unity in the celebration of the Mass, was based on a major survey of the world's bishops, in which the response apparently showed worrying fault lines appearing in the Church's liturgical landscape. In some places, particularly in France and USA, a serious trend was showing in which certain Catholics who favoured the older form of the Mass had begun to disparage the new, to the point of refusing to attend it, and in some cases to reject the Vatican II Council that mandated it. The whole thing had become quite a widespread divisive political issue with serious spiritual implications for the Church as one. Pope John Paul II had seen this tension in its early phases and had tried to contain it by giving some concessions to the celebration of the old form. Pope Benedict opened the doors even wider, although subject to a review, which for some reason didn't take place. Pope Francis was left solving the problem, which by his reign had become quite acute. His response was Traditionis Custodes. It was a call for Catholics to unite around the Mass, to be educated about the Mass, and to return to the high standards of beauty and dignity and unity that the Mass actually and fundamentally requires. To this end, he put some brakes on the old form and indicated that the Church was to move towards the celebration of the new form, the official one mandated by Vatican II and sanctioned by all post-conciliar popes. This document really struck the death blow to Francis's acceptability amongst traditionalist Catholics, many of whom had already labelled him as an arch-iconoclast, heretic, or usurper on the papal throne. It's unlikely that anything else he has written will have been read, if read at all, with any objectivity. As a follow-up to this incendiary motu proprio, Pope Francis offered a magnificent document entitled Desiderio Desideravi, echoing the touching words of Christ at the Last Supper in his institution of the Eucharist. Quote, "With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you." End quote. It contains a deep and beautiful theology of the liturgy, focusing on Christ's self-sacrifice and showing how liturgy wars are inappropriate to the Christian life, tending as they do to focus too much on personal preferences and injured rights. There's an emphasis in this document on the Church's own God-given right to manage her own rites of divine worship, and the non-optional nature of the liturgical reforms of Vatican II. Francis decries the abuses that have crept into some celebrations of the liturgy, roundly criticising priests who indulge their own idiosyncrasies in the new form of Mass, and laity who are too focused on their own thoughts and feelings in the old form. As antidotes to liturgical abuses, Pope Francis urges liturgical education of both priests and people in the art of celebrating the sacred ceremonies. He points out the commitment of will, which we must have in offering ourselves at the liturgy, instead of amassing quasi-political kudos. Not very surprisingly, this very traditional and profound treatise on the liturgy was scarcely named in the flood of tirades against Pope Francis. It was obviously too well grounded in traditional spiritual concepts and basic religious truth to be of help in sustaining the carefully nurtured negative image created of him by his critics. Naturally, it did nothing to neutralize the animosity towards him as occasioned by traditiones. For many people, Pope Francis was a political figure, more or less acceptable according to where your political convictions lay. His purely spiritual documents, Gaudete et Exsultate and Dilexit Nos, simply came out, the former in 2018 and the latter in 2024, without a media murmur. Perhaps this was because they conveyed the Pope in his primary role as spiritual father and director of souls. Perhaps because they offer fundamental spiritual counsel to everyone in the Church, everyone who has a soul to be purified and saved. Gaudete et Exsultate is a spiritual treatise for every man. It's wall-to-wall spiritual direction with the lot, exhortations to those necessary spiritual elements, daily effort, the grace of the Holy Spirit, solitude, silence before God, and recourse to the example and intercession of the saints. It covers warnings about false forms of holiness, modern Gnosticism and Pelagianism, which narrow our religious horizons and rely on our own powers to navigate life. The Pope explores each of the Beatitudes and contrasts them with what the modern way of life throws up at us. He gives examples of holiness from today's world as it is lived by ordinary, humble people. He warns us against the devastating effects on our spiritual lives of technology. He even holds up for us the necessity of a sense of humour. Above all, he exhorts us to prayer and the making of time for it, to penance and spiritual and moral combat, to the practice of discernment and a daily examination of conscience. He quotes copiously from the Scriptures and from a large range of saints. No one, even the most hardened traditionalists and liberals, could argue with the content of this beautiful document, but could instead think about taking some of it on board and finding true fulfillment and final beatitude as a result. The most recent spiritual writing of Pope Francis was a truly magnificent encyclical entitled Dilexit Nos. It focuses entirely on devotion to the Sacred Heart, a long, rich, biblically rooted teaching with copious references and quotations from a huge range of saints of the Sacred Heart, going back to the early fathers and doctors of the Church through to Saint Thérèse of Lisieux and Saint Charles de Foucauld. This encyclical is pure classical spirituality, bringing out the full meaning of this ancient and very Catholic devotion and explaining in very intelligible theological terms some of its tenets which have puzzled Catholics over the years, such as how we can console Christ, who is now in the perfect happiness of heaven. It ends with a very down-to-earth relating of the devotion to the needs of our modern secular world. Again, this beautiful, uplifting and enlightening spiritual work has garnered little, if any, mention in the media, so again, those who most need it will not know of its existence. And the smear campaign against the Pope is free to go on perpetuating itself without modification or break. Overall, it's possible to scan the landscape of Pope Francis's teaching and see a whole panorama, not of left-wing politics distorting everything from the Mass to the environment and social issues like LGBTQ+, but of a father's concern for his children's physical, moral and spiritual life, and his advice as to how these must be ordered, all based on Christ's teaching and that of his Church. It's just a pity that most people have either not been fortunate enough to be exposed to it, or wise enough to take what they have found in the media with a very large grain of salt.